My mother looked at the brooch in my hand like it was something I'd stolen off a dead woman's body. In a way, I suppose she wasn't wrong. It had belonged to my grandmother, Beatrice Vale, and Beatrice had been gone for 11 years. But I hadn't stolen it. She'd given it to me herself, the spring before she died, pressed it into my palm, and told me it was the only thing in that house that had ever belonged to someone who loved me without conditions. I wore it to my sister's engagement party because I thought, for one night, I could bring a piece of the one person who'd never made me feel like a guest in my own family. I should have known better. The Vale Manor ballroom was lit the way it always was for these things, gold light pooling over white tablecloths, a string quartet working through something soft and forgettable. 200 of Savannah's most important people, drifting between champagne towers and old money small talk, judges, bank presidents, a state senator who'd known my father since law school. Camille stood near the fireplace in a dress, the color of champagne itself, Grant Holloway's hand resting at the small of her back like he already owned the room, which, in a sense, he was about to. I came in quietly. I always did. Quiet was the only way I'd learned to survive that house. My mother found me near the bar before I'd even finished my first glass of water. "What is that?" she said, nodding at the brooch, not even bothering to lower her voice. "It was Grandma Beatrice's," I said. "I thought I'd wear something of hers tonight." "You thought wrong." She reached for it, and I stepped back before her fingers closed around the pin. Her smile didn't move, but her eyes did. "This is Camille's night, not yours, not your grandmother's. Take it off before someone asks where you got it." I didn't take it off. That was apparently the wrong answer. An hour later, a woman I half recognized, the wife of a circuit judge, I think touched my mother's arm and asked, loud enough for the people near us to hear, "And who is this lovely young woman?" My mother's pause lasted half a second too long. "This is Elena," she said finally. "The way you'd introduce a piece of furniture nobody asked about. She's around. She doesn't usually attend things like this." The judge's wife laughed, unsure if it was a joke. I smiled, because that was the only thing I had left to do with my face. But that wasn't the part that made the room go quiet. The part that did it came 20 minutes later, when my mother spotted the brooch catching the light as I reached for a second glass of champagne I didn't actually want. She crossed the floor faster than I'd seen her move in years, and her voice when it came wasn't a whisper anymore. "Take off my mother-in-law's brooch right now," she said. "I will not have you upstaging your sister with stolen jewelry on the one night that matters for this family." "It's not stolen, Mom. She gave it to me." "She gave you nothing. You've spent your whole life taking what doesn't belong to you. Attention, sympathy, now jewelry." Her voice climbed, and the quartet, sensing blood in the water the way musicians always do, played softer. "You have never had any class, Elena. You don't know how to behave in a room like this. You never did." I felt my face go hot. I felt 200 sets of eyes find me at once. I felt every old wound in my chest open at the same time, the way they always did in that house, on cue, like she'd rehearsed it. I said nothing. "You embarrass this family every time you walk through that door," she went on, louder now, performing for an audience that had stopped pretending not to watch. "You embarrass the Vale name. You should never have come back here tonight, and frankly, you should never have come back at all." She turned to the two men in dark suits, stationed near the entrance men I'd assumed were simply part of the decor, the way wealthy families always have someone standing quietly by a door. "Walk her out," my mother said. I didn't argue. I didn't cry, though something in my throat was working very hard to make me. I set my glass down on the nearest table, smoothed the front of my dress, and started walking toward the door myself, before the men in suits could even reach me. I had been humiliated in that house more times than I could count. I had learned, a long time ago, that the only power I had left in those moments was choosing how I left the room. I remember the exact sound the room made as I walked the low murmur of conversation, trying to pretend it hadn't just witnessed something cruel. The click of my heels against the marble my father had imported from Italy the year I was born. The small, polite cough of someone near the dessert table who clearly didn't know where to look. I kept my chin level. I kept my hands still at my sides, though they wanted very badly to shake. Somewhere behind me, I heard my mother exhale, satisfied, the way she always sounded after she'd won something that wasn't actually a contest. I thought, walking toward that door, about every other time I'd left a room in that house feeling smaller than when I'd entered it. I thought about how many of those exits I'd absorbed quietly, alone, in a car or a bathroom or the long drive back to Atlanta, because there had never been anyone there to catch me on the way out. This time there was. What my mother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 8 months after my father's funeral, I had already had 3 conversations with a man named Nathaniel Rowe. And Nathaniel Rowe had told me, in his slow, careful way, that if I was ever cast out of that house in front of witnesses, I wouldn't have to call anyone. He would already be on his way. I was 3 steps from the door when I heard it open from the outside instead. To understand why that ballroom went silent the way it did, you have to understand what it was like growing up the daughter Vivian Vale never quite wanted to claim. I was born first. For a year, I'm told, that mattered. Then Camille came along, fairer-skinned by the particular standards my mother valued, easier to dress, easier to photograph, easier to parade. My mother used to say Camille had the Vale look, and I learned early that whatever that look was, I didn't have it, and no amount of good behavior would earn it for me. There's a portrait that still hangs in the east hallway of Vale Manor, my parents, Camille, and me, ages 6 and 4. I'm standing half a step behind everyone else, my hand barely visible at the edge of the frame. My mother had asked the photographer to angle the shot that way. I didn't understand it at 6. I understood it perfectly by 12. I remember the exact year I understood it too. I was 12, and a cousin visiting from Charleston pointed at the portrait and asked, with the blunt honesty only children seem to manage, why I looked like I was trying to disappear. I didn't have an answer for her then. I spent the next 2 decades building one. My father, Arthur Vale, was a different kind of absence, not cruel, just gone. He built Vale Holdings up from a single trucking company into something that owned half the warehouses between Savannah and Charleston. And that kind of building takes a man away from his own house for years at a time. I used to tell myself he didn't know how things were inside those walls. I told myself that for a long time, because the alternative that he knew and didn't stop it was a wound I wasn't ready to touch. The one person who ever made me feel like I belonged somewhere was my grandmother, Beatrice Vale, my father's mother. She lived 2 floors above the rest of us in a wing my mother called the old part of the house, with a faint curl of disdain, like Beatrice's presence was an architectural inconvenience rather than a person. Beatrice used to braid my hair on Sunday afternoons and tell me stories about my father as a boy, how he'd cried the first time their dog ran off, how he used to sneak biscuits to the housekeeper's children when he thought no one was watching. She told me once, while pinning that very brooch to the collar of my church dress, that I had an old soul and a soft heart, and that the world would try to convince me both of those things were weaknesses. "They're not weaknesses, little lark," she said. "They're the only things in this family worth keeping." She called me Little Lark because, she said, I was the only quiet thing in a house full of peacocks. Beatrice died when I was 21. My mother didn't cry at the funeral. Camille did, performatively, in a black dress that had clearly been chosen with photographers in mind, though none came. I cried in the car afterward, alone, because that was the only place in my life that had ever felt safe enough to do it. After Beatrice was gone, the house got colder. My mother leaned harder into Camille dance lessons, debutante balls, an internship at a gallery that existed mostly to be mentioned at dinner parties. I leaned into school, then into work, building a life 2 hours away in Atlanta, before eventually coming home to run outreach for a Savannah Housing Foundation, a job my mother once described to her bridge club as Elena's little hobby. My father and I barely spoke those years. When we did, it was about business, never about Beatrice, never about my mother, never about the year I spent in therapy, trying to understand why I flinched every time a door slammed in that house. I told myself it was because he was busy. I told myself a lot of things. There was a stretch, around the time I turned 28, when I tried to close the distance myself. I called more often. I drove down for Sunday dinners. I wasn't technically invited to, sitting at the far end of the table while my mother steered every conversation toward Camille's latest accomplishment. My father would ask me, almost mechanically, how the foundation was going, and I would answer in 3 sentences before the conversation moved on without me. I remember thinking, more than once, that he simply didn't care to know more. It would take a leather folder and a dead man's letter to teach me how wrong that assumption was. Then, 8 months ago, he died of a heart that had apparently been failing quietly for years, the way most things in that family failed quietly, behind closed doors, dressed up for the public. At the funeral, my mother stood at the front of the church in black Chanel, accepting condolences like a queen accepting tribute. Camille wept into Grant's shoulder. I stood near the back, in the same spot I'd occupied my whole life, and I didn't cry, because I genuinely didn't know, at that point, whether my father had ever truly seen me at all. I found out 3 weeks later that he had. A man I'd never met called my office and introduced himself as Nathaniel Rowe, a notary who'd known my father since they were both young men starting out in Savannah with nothing but ambition and bad suits. He asked if we could meet somewhere private. I almost said no. I'm glad now that I didn't. Nathaniel Rowe was 68 years old, built like a man who'd spent decades carrying heavy things and refused to let age change that. He met me at a small cafe off Bull Street, ordered black coffee, and didn't waste time on pleasantries. I knew your father before he had 2 nickels to rub together, he told me, almost as a way of establishing his credentials before he said anything harder to hear. We were both clerking for the same firm downtown, back when Savannah still had streetcars running past Forsyth Park. Arthur was the only one of us who talked about wanting a family someday instead of just wanting a fortune. It always struck me as the more honest ambition. Your father came to my office 11 months before he died, he said, alone. No lawyers from the firm, no Malcolm Voss, nobody from that house, just him. I remember my hands going still around my cup. He wanted to change his will, Nathaniel continued, properly, notarized, filed, sealed against contest. He told me he'd let things go on too long in that family, and he wasn't going to let them go on after he was gone. What things? I asked, though some part of me already knew. He told me how you'd been treated, Elena. All of it. The way conversations got twisted before they reached you. The way your mother intercepted things, messages, invitations, even some of his own letters to you, apparently, over the years. He said he didn't piece it together until close to the end, and when he did, it broke something in him. I want to tell you I felt vindicated in that moment. Mostly, I just felt tired. Tired in the specific way you feel when something you suspected your whole life is finally said out loud by someone else. There's more? Nathaniel said, and slid a sealed envelope across the table, not the will itself, just a letter. He asked me to give you this privately, whenever I judged the time was right. I think the time is right now. I didn't open it there. I couldn't. I took it home and sat with it on my kitchen counter for 2 days before I worked up the courage. When I finally read it, I understood why my father had waited until the end of his life to become honest. Some truths take a whole life to find their way to the surface. But the letter wasn't the only thing Nathaniel told me that day at the cafe. He also told me about the will itself, the real one, filed and sealed months before my father died, replacing an older version that had favored Camille and left my mother in near total control of the company. The new will named me as primary beneficiary of the Vale Family Trust, majority shareholder of Vale Holdings, and sole owner of Vale Manor itself. There's a condition, Nathaniel said. Your father was very specific about this. The will is to remain sealed and private unless you are publicly excluded from the family, disowned, humiliated, removed from a family event in front of witnesses. He said if that ever happened, he wanted the truth read into the record immediately, in front of whoever was watching. Why would he build a condition like that? Nathaniel's eyes were steady. Because he knew your mother, and because he wanted you to never again stand in a room while she diminished you, without the truth standing there beside you. I didn't think, walking out of that cafe, that the condition would ever be triggered. I told myself my mother had her cruelty, but she also had her sense of public performance. She would never risk a scene like that in front of 200 witnesses. I should have known better than that too. 3 weeks before Camille's engagement party, Nathaniel called me again. If anything happens at that party, he said, anything public, anything in front of people, you call me, and I will already be in the car. I told him I doubted it would come to that. He told me, gently, that he'd known my mother for 30 years, and he doubted it wouldn't. I didn't call him that night. I didn't have to. He was already at the door. Nathaniel Rowe walked into that ballroom carrying a leather folder under one arm like it weighed nothing at all, though I knew exactly how much it carried. The two men in dark suits froze halfway between me and the exit, uncertain whether an elderly man in a grey suit qualified as a threat worth intercepting. My mother's face did something I had genuinely never seen it do before it faltered. Vivian, Nathaniel said, his voice carrying easily across a room that had gone unnervingly quiet. I think you know why I'm here. This is a private family event, Nathaniel, my mother said, recovering fast, sliding back into the performance she'd built her whole life around. Whatever business you think you have can wait. It can't, he said. Arthur was very specific about that. The mention of my father's name did something to the room. I watched Grant Holloway's expression shift interest, sharpening into something closer to concern. I watched Camille take a half step away from him, toward me, like some part of her already understood the ground was about to move. Arthur left instructions, Nathaniel said, opening the folder. He told me that if Elena was ever publicly excluded from this family, humiliated, removed, cast out in front of witnesses, his true will was to be read aloud on the spot, regardless of where or when that happened. This is absurd, my mother said, though her voice had thinned considerably. Arthur's will was settled months ago. I have copies. My attorney handled everything. You have a copy of an earlier version, Nathaniel said. Arthur filed a new will 11 months before he died, notarized, sealed, on record with the county. I have the certified copy in this folder. Grant stepped forward then, and I understood, watching him, exactly why he'd been so eager to marry into this family. I'd like to see that documentation, he said, in the tone of a man already calculating what it might mean for him. You'll see all of it, Nathaniel said. Everyone will. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He began to read. The mansion, he said, the controlling shares of Vale Holdings and the entirety of the Vale Family Trust were left to Elena Vale, his eldest daughter. Vivian would retain a limited personal allowance and her right to remain in the manor's east wing for the remainder of her life, but no control over the company, the trust, or the property itself. Camille would receive a modest inheritance, sufficient for comfort, but no controlling stake in anything that mattered to the family's future. The room didn't gasp the way rooms do in movies. It went silent in a worse way, the silence of 200 people doing rapid, uncomfortable math about who they should be speaking to for the rest of the evening. "This is fabricated," my mother said, but the words came out smaller than she intended. "Arthur would never have done this without telling me." "He told me," Nathaniel said. "He told his attorney. He told the county recorder's office. He simply chose not to tell you, Vivian, because he suspected correctly, as it turns out that you would have found a way to stop him. You have no proof he was of sound mind when he signed this. I have video of the signing," Nathaniel said. "I have his physician's written assessment from that same week. I have everything required to survive exactly this kind of challenge, because Arthur knew you'd try to make it." I watched my mother's eyes dart briefly toward Malcolm Voss, the smallest flicker of a question passing between them, and I understood, in that instant, that this wasn't the first time the two of them had quietly coordinated a story together. It would not be the last time that particular look cost her something. My mother's eyes found mine across the room, and for the first time in my life, I watched something other than contempt move across her face. It looked almost like fear. "There's one more thing," Nathaniel said, and I felt my chest tighten, because I hadn't known about this part. Arthur included a clause. "If Vivian Vale attempts to contest this will through false accusations against Elena, or attempts to discredit it through any public claim known to be untrue, documentation of certain financial irregularities involving Vivian and Malcolm Voss will be forwarded to the district attorney's office." Somewhere near the bar, I heard a glass set down a little too hard. "That's not your concern tonight, Mr. Rowe," Malcolm Voss said, stepping forward from where he'd been quietly observing near the windows. I hadn't even registered he was in the room. "It will be everyone's concern," Nathaniel said, "the moment Vivian opens her mouth to deny it. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment, standing in the middle of that ballroom while 200 witnesses absorbed the unraveling of everything my mother had spent her life building. Mostly, I felt my father's absence more sharply than I had since the funeral, because the will wasn't the part that broke me open. The letter was. Nathaniel had brought it with him, sealed in the same leather folder, and he asked quietly if I wanted him to read it aloud or hand it to me privately. I told him to read it. I wanted, just once, for the whole room to hear what my father actually thought of me, instead of what my mother had spent 30 years convincing them to believe. "My dearest Elena," Nathaniel read, and I watched my mother's composure crack at the words my father had chosen. "I am writing this letter because I do not believe I will have the courage to say these things to your face, and I have spent too much of your life being a coward in rooms where you needed me to be brave." The room had gone so quiet I could hear my own pulse. "I did not see, for far too long, how your mother treated you. I want to be honest. Even now some part of me did not want to see it, because seeing it meant admitting I had failed you. I let myself believe the version of events that was easiest. I am sorry for every year I let that be true. My eyes were burning. I didn't move my hands to wipe them. I let the room see. I learned the truth slowly, piece by piece, in the last 2 years of my life. I learned that messages from you had been intercepted. I learned that invitations meant for you had quietly disappeared. I learned that conversations between us had been edited before they ever reached either of us, so that we both grew to believe the other simply didn't care. I hadn't known that part. I'd spent years believing my father's distance was simple indifference. Hearing, now, that some of it had been engineered cracked something old and tired loose in my chest. I thought about every birthday card that arrived a week late, every phone call that seemed to end too quickly, every time I'd assumed the silence between us meant he simply hadn't thought of me. I had built an entire understanding of my father around an absence that, it turned out, had been manufactured by someone else's hands. You should also know this, Elena, because I think you deserve to hear it stated plainly. It was you, not Camille, who came to me 18 months ago with concerns about irregularities in the company's accounts. It was you who first noticed the discrepancies tied to Malcolm Voss's handling of certain trust transactions. You did this quietly, asking for nothing, expecting no credit. You did it because you loved this family, even when this family gave you very little reason to. I heard a small, sharp intake of breath from Camille. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. Not yet. I am leaving you the mansion, the company, and the trust, not because you are my eldest, and not out of guilt, though I carry plenty of that. I am leaving them to you, because you are the only person in this family who has never once asked me for anything except my attention. You were the guardian of this family's conscience long before I gave you any reason to be. I should have told you that while I was alive. I am telling you now because I am out of time to wait any longer. Nathaniel paused, then looked up. There's one final piece, he said. Arthur left a recording as well. He asked that it be shown only if the will was ever read publicly under these exact circumstances. He set a small tablet on the table beside him and pressed play. My father's face filled the screen, thinner than I remembered him, sitting in his study, the one room in that house that had always smelled like him. He looked directly into the camera, like he knew, somehow, exactly who would eventually be standing in front of it. Little Lark, he said, and the nickname, Beatrice's nickname, the one I hadn't heard another living soul use in 11 years, landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. If you're hearing this, it means I waited too long, the way I waited too long for almost everything that mattered. I am asking you to forgive me, not for the will, for all the years before it. He paused, and even on the recording, I could see his hands shake slightly against the desk. Your grandmother used to tell me you had the kindest heart in this family, and that the rest of us didn't deserve it half the time. She was right. I hope, by the time you see this, you've stopped believing the things this house tried to convince you of. You were never the disgrace in this family, Elena. You were the only one of us who never needed to be anything but yourself to be worth keeping. The recording ended. Nobody in that ballroom moved. My mother was the first to speak, and I will give her this much. Even in collapse, she tried to perform control. This is manipulation, she said, though her voice had lost the iron it usually carried. Elena clearly worked on your father in his final months, isolated him, convinced him to cut his own wife and daughter out of. He recorded that message 4 months before his health declined, Nathaniel said evenly. His physician examined him the same week. There is no version of events here where Elena manipulated a dying man, Vivian, and I think you know that, which is why you're reaching for it anyway. You have no right. I have every right, Nathaniel said, and for the first time that evening, something sharpened in his voice. Arthur asked me to protect his daughter's truth, and I intend to honor that, whatever it costs the rest of this room socially tonight. Malcolm Voss tried to slip toward the side entrance. A man near the bar, I'd later learn he was a retired judge my father had known for decades, stepped almost casually into his path. I think you'd better stay, Malcolm, the judge said. Sounds like there's a conversation the district attorney's office might want to have with you. A woman near the dessert table, the same circuit judge's wife who'd asked who I was earlier that evening, was already pulling out her phone, though whether to call someone or simply to have something to do with her hands, I couldn't say. I noticed, almost absently, that no one in that room was looking at my mother the way they had an hour earlier. The shift was subtle, but it was complete. Grant Holloway, to his credit, or perhaps his discredit, didn't bother pretending anymore. He turned to Camille, and I watched him recalculate her, in real time, now that she was no longer attached to a controlling interest in anything. Camille, he said carefully, we should talk about this somewhere private. We're talking about it right here, Camille said, and her voice cracked, but it didn't break. She looked at our mother with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, not anger exactly, something closer to grief. Did you know about the messages? About what you did to her? My mother didn't answer. Mom, Camille said again, quieter now, did you know? I did what I had to do to protect this family's name, my mother finally said, and even then, even in that moment, she couldn't bring herself to say it had been wrong. Your sister was never going to represent this family the way it needed to be represented. I made decisions so this family could survive. She's your daughter, Camille said, not a liability. Camille's voice shook on the last word, and I realized, watching her, that she was grieving something too, not the inheritance she'd just lost, but the version of our mother she'd spent her whole life believing in. It is a particular kind of loss. Finding out the person who chose you over someone else did it for the wrong reasons, in the wrong way, at someone else's expense. I watched my mother's face for some flicker of remorse, some small fracture I could hold on to. I didn't find one. What I found instead was a woman who had spent 30 years building a version of herself so brittle that admitting fault would have meant the whole structure came down. I stepped forward then, for the first time since Nathaniel had walked through that door. I'm not going to ask the county to investigate the accounts, I said, and the room's attention swung fully to me. Nathaniel will handle whatever's required there, separate from me. I don't want revenge. I never did. Then what do you want? My mother said, and for once the question sounded almost honest. I wanted you to see me, I said. Just once, in a room like this, without deciding in advance that I didn't belong in it. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered the way they might in a story built for easy endings. Camille came and stood beside me instead, quietly, and that, more than anything that had been read aloud that night, felt like the truest thing that had happened in that ballroom in years. My mother stood alone near the fireplace, surrounded by 200 people who had spent the evening admiring her, all of them now carefully avoiding her eyes. I didn't feel triumphant watching that. I felt, mostly, very tired and very ready to go home, except, as it turned out, I already was home. I just hadn't realized it yet. It took 4 months to settle everything properly: the trust, the company shares, the formal transfer of Vale Manor. Malcolm Voss resigned before the district attorney's office finished its review, which Nathaniel told me was, in his 30 years of practice, the closest thing to a confession he'd ever seen. My mother stayed in the East Wing, as the will allowed, though something between us had shifted permanently. We are not close. I don't think we ever will be. But she no longer speaks to me the way she used to, and some days, that quiet absence of cruelty is as much peace as I know how to ask for. Camille and I talk now in a way we never did growing up, carefully, slowly, like two people learning a language neither of us was ever taught. She ended things with Grant 3 weeks after the party. She told me, the night she moved into a small apartment near the river, that she'd spent her whole life being the daughter our mother performed. And she didn't know, yet, who she was without that role. I told her I understood that better than almost anyone alive. As for the mansion, I didn't move in right away. I sat with the decision for months, walking those halls alone some evenings, trying to decide what Vale Manor should be now that it was mine. I thought about Beatrice, braiding my hair on Sunday afternoons in the wing my mother once dismissed as inconvenient. I thought about the portrait in the east hallway, the one where 6-year-old me stood half out of frame. I thought about my father's recorded voice, calling me by a name I thought had died with my grandmother. In the end, I didn't keep the mansion as a private home. I partnered with the housing foundation I already worked for, and we turned the east wing, the old part of the house, The part nobody ever wanted into transitional housing for women rebuilding their lives after hardship. The ballroom, where I was once walked toward an exit, now hosts job training sessions on Tuesday mornings. I had the portrait in the east hallway reframed. I asked the photographer's old assistant, now retired, if there were other negatives from that day. There was one, it turned out, taken a few seconds later than the one my mother chose one, where I'd stepped, just slightly, back into frame. I hung that one instead, in a plain frame, at the same height as everyone else's. Some evenings, I still walk the halls of Vale Manor after the Foundation's offices close for the day, and I let myself notice how different the silence feels now. It isn't the silence I grew up with, careful, watchful, waiting for someone to say the wrong thing. It's the ordinary quiet of a house that has finally stopped performing for anyone. I wear Beatrice's brooch most days now, not for anyone's benefit but my own. It sits, these days, on the collar of a simple blazer I wear to outreach meetings, in a building that used to make me feel like an intruder, and now, slowly, finally, feels like mine. I stood in front of my father's portrait the week the Foundation's first residents moved in, and I thought about everything that letter had said, about cowardice, about the years he let himself believe the easier version of things. I thought about how long it had taken him to call me brave instead of inconvenient. I forgave him, not all at once, and not because forgiving him was easy. I forgave him because holding on to that particular grief was costing me more than it was costing him, and because somewhere in that house, a woman who used to call me Little Lark had taught me, a long time ago, that compassion wasn't a weakness. It was the only inheritance that mattered. Some nights, when the Foundation's offices have gone quiet, and the only sound left in Vale Manor is the old grandfather clock in the front hall, I think about that ballroom, the music that stopped, the silence that followed, the version of myself who walked toward that door already believing she had nothing left to wait for. I think about how close I came to leaving that night, believing my father's silence had always meant indifference. I am grateful, more than I know how to say, that I was wrong. I didn't win that house by becoming my mother. I won it by finally becoming myself.